Before we get down to the nitty-gritty, I want to thank my animators Adam Midzuk or Kuzim and Tyler Addison for the animations in this video. If you like their work, consider following them on Twitter. Links in the description and comment section below. Now, on with the show. Everyone loves the humble hippo, right? How could you hate that lovable face? Okay, maybe not your style. How about their wee little babes? Is that not the cutest little pudgy baby you've ever seen? Hippos occupy an awfully specific kind of niche, but that niche wasn't always occupied by hippos. There were bizarre Desmostylians of the Paleocene, Lurdusaurus of the Mesozoic, and there were a group of stem mammals that took advantage of this niche during the end of the Paleozoic era. The largest of these bizarre animals that were once called mammal-like reptiles was Cotylorhynchus. There was a stretch of time during the early 1900s when paleontologists were specializing in trying to uncover and understand the mysteries of evolution. On the onset, this is no different than it is today. However, upon closer inspection, this move towards a clearer narrative of the history of life had a more desperate air to it. Paleontology was only about 200 years old at the time, and early, more basic life forms which gave rise to the groups we know of today were few and far between. Dinosaurs were written off by many as dead-end evolutionary losers. They simply invested in the wrong body parts and fell into an aristocratic pigeonhole they couldn't get out of until they had no choice but to succumb to extinction. This, according to many narratives at the time, was for the express purpose of paving the way for the glory of mammal kind, for we are surely superior to the dinosaurs in every way. Consequently, many paleontologists focused their efforts away from dinosaurs and towards the bizarre mammals of the Paleocene and Eocene. Others sidestepped the dinosaurs in the opposite way, narrowing their search to the funky barbarians of the Paleozoic era. Carboniferous and Permian rock layers were unearthed by a slew of paleontologists from the time of Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh to the time of Everett Clare Olson and Company. Don't get me wrong, paleontologists have been scrounging around the Permian rocks since before our current obsession with dinosaurs, and of course dinosaurs have been the object of cultural adoration since the creation of the word in 1842. Among the abundance of Permian projects of the early 1900s, one of them resulted in the description of a tubby, small-headed herbivore of janky anatomy, Cotylorhynchus. Finding tiny. Oddly enough, the original tome that described the first remains of what would be called Cotylorhynchus is extraordinarily difficult to find. I scrounged Google, Google Scholar, and other paper conglomerates for a whole hour and found nothing. Obviously that means it doesn't exist, right fellow Gen Zers?
How do you do, fellow kids?
I actually found the right journal and volume it was originally published in, but it was missing from the digital copy. It's super easy, barely an inconvenience, as another paper from the late 1960s recounts information from the original description, so I can also recount how the original specimens were found. The history of Cotylorhynchus stretches back to 1937. That was when the description of the bones was first published. According to acclaimed paleontologist Alfred Sherwood Romer, who specialized in vertebrate evolution, the first remains of the critter were found by then graduate assistant Dr. W.S. Strain in a layer of rock called the Hennessy Shale in Oklahoma. This slice of Earth's crust is located about 4 3/4 miles west of Navina, Logan County. This slice also dates to the early Permian, roughly 298 to 272 million years ago. This was a time long before the dinosaurs were a sparkle in an archosaur's eye. This was a time when the main groups of land animals were stem mammals. By stem mammals, I mean groups of critters that are our cousins, but cannot be classified as true mammals. They used to be called mammal-like reptiles when they were considered to have diverged from the reptiles, but this is no longer thought of as helpful when trying to understand evolutionary relationships. Finding the Cotylorhynchus specimens in this Oklahoma section of early Permian rock was unusual, as the strip of Permian rock in Oklahoma doesn't get exhumed by nature as frequently as it does in nearby states. What I mean by this is that the layer of rock which dates to the early Permian stretches over a bunch of different states. It goes from Texas through Oklahoma and into Kansas. Therefore, there's a strip of that early Permian rock that doesn't readily produce a bunch of awesome fossils across Oklahoma. It does produce a large number of fossils in Texas. Why this is the case probably has something to do with the better rainfall and vegetative cover across Oklahoma, which is not as strong in Texas. Plus, Texas has a lot more variation in its geography, whereas Oklahoma is roughly flat throughout. A more varied terrain in Texas means that bones have more chances to be revealed near the surface, so us paleontologists can find them and know where to start digging. The Oklahoma remains consisted of an incomplete skull, jaw parts, a front foot, and an interclavicle, which is a sometimes spoon or spike-shaped piece of bone between the clavicle bones. Shortly after this first relatively fragmentary fossil was uncovered, a nearly complete skeleton, only missing the noggin, was found in the same horizon. In geology, horizon refers to an exact layer, so in the case of our critters here, the second was found in the exact same layer of rock as the first, just not in the exact same location. In fact, the second specimen was found about 50 miles away from the first. Obviously, there are ways to tell if a horizon is the same, but that's not a topic for this video. Between the years of 1937 and 1939, a whole bunch of these things were found in the same area as the second specimen. These guys were excavated and prepared by the helpful hands of workers from the Works Progress Administration. This was around the time of the Great Depression after all. There was so many skeletons being unearthed that the guys who first started this whole site were sending specimen off to different museums: the Chicago Field, American Museum of New York, Smithsonian, and Cambridge. All of these skeletons were given the name Cotylorhynchus romeri, or Romer's cup snout. Cotylos meaning cup, rhynchus meaning snout, and of course, the species name honoring Alfred Romer. With all the specimens uncovered from Oklahoma, a really good idea of the animal's appearance can be made. But before I discuss the biology and anatomy of Cotylorhynchus, I think I should expand upon what was found after these late 1930s finds. I feel like I should do that because there's currently 3 valid species of Cotylorhynchus: Romeri, Hancocki, and Bransoni. They differ mostly in size and proportions. The remains of Cotylorhynchus hancocki were described in 1953 by Everett Olson, who was an expert in Permian and Triassic vertebrates, and James Bierbauer. The bones were found in the San Angelo Formation of Hardeman County, Texas. Unlike the Oklahoma rocks, this layer dates to the Middle Permian, tens of millions of years after the Oklahoma specimens. The remains of the Hancocki species differ from the first Romeri species, most obviously in size, but I'll get to tallying up the sizes here in a bit. Everett Olson and Herbert Barghausen, 2 Permian paleontologists, described the remains of the third species of Cotylorhynchus in 1953. They named the third species Cotylorhynchus bransoni in honor of Dr. Carl Branson, who helped out the project. A whole bunch of fossils of this species came out of the Flower Pot Formation, located in Kingfisher County, Oklahoma. These guys come from the Upper Permian, so the Late Permian. This chunk of time saw most of the supercontinent Pangaea desertify from an increase in greenhouse gases and a rise in global temperatures due to massive volcanic eruptions which belched out toxic gases for hundreds of thousands of years. This saw the end of the Cotylorhynchus group. Pinhead biology. Size does matter. Now that we got the boring history out of the way, we can get to the ooshy-scooshy bits everyone loves so much. Cotylorhynchus just so happens to probably be the largest terrestrial vertebrate on the planet at the time of its existence. The largest species is Hancocki, which is estimated to have reached about 20 feet, 6 meters in length. Some online sources suggest it may have weighed in as much as 1,500 kilograms or 1.6 tons, but I don't know how much I trust that. The first named and slightly smaller species, Romeri, was estimated by Romer and Price in 1940 at around 9.4 feet or 2.86 meters in length and around 331 kilograms or 730 pounds, nearly half as large as Hancockii. The Branson species was likely somewhere in between these sizes, but I couldn't find perfect estimations for this species. These were the largest critters around regardless. Little could have taken them down. What the hell is going on with it though? Okay, so this thing is super duper weird, right? It's got one of the strangest heads I've ever seen. Not because of any spectacular display structures, doodads, or crests, but because of its size. That thing is ridiculously disproportionate. It's nature's pinhead.
Who you calling pinhead?
Cotylorhynchus had an enormously large body and barrel-shaped torso. From the side, you can't quite tell just how flat of a these things were. Let me just... There. Now, you see just how much of a wide load these suckers were. I'll let you in on why in just a sec here. Moving away from the bulging body, you'll notice the giant bracer block of a shoulder girdle, which attaches massive, dummy thick forelimbs to the beer keg body. Each bone in that forearm is also unnecessarily chunky. The ends of each bone, the humerus, radius, and ulna, flare out like nobody's business. Clearly, these held up tremendously strong muscles. The hands are another odd feature, so let's take a closer look. Each of the 4 paws are flat. Each bone within the paw and the paw overall are just really wide and flat. The claws are flattened from top to bottom, the fingy bones are flat, and so are the crispy, crunchy hand bones. Are you noticing that the arm bones are pretty flat too? All of this flatness isn't a result of being crushed by rocks. All Cotylorhynchus fossils preserve this flatness. These things also had a super long tail, but there's nothing special about it, so let's move on to the weirdest part of the critter, its head. From a quick glance, the head itself doesn't seem that weird. It's just the size difference compared to the body that throws you off. But as you look at the head more closely, you'll see that it too is weird. The damned thing is wedge-shaped, with a pointy little chin, huge cone-shaped iguana-like twofers, and a big-ass schnoz. I mean, look at those nostril openings. No wonder its name means cup snout. It's got a pair of red solos for a nose. The nostril openings may have been this big to help the animal breathe better, or may have housed sensory or moisture-conserving organs. Behind that nose is an eye hole that's actually bigger than the nose. Man, this thing is
Whack.
What does this all mean, though? Originally, it was hypothesized that the big lug used its broad turtle-like limbs for digging. That makes sense to me. It had 4 pairs of 5 flattened cone-shaped claws, which are a perfect shape for digging. What would it have been digging for? This thing is so big and fat and had such a small head that there's no way it could chase down prey. This thing was predominantly, if not exclusively, herbivorous. So if that digging lifestyle had remained a valid hypothesis, then it would have been digging for roots and tubers, which are rich in carbs and sugars. However, a more fitting lifestyle was to be found in the bones. A paper published in 2016 by Marcus Lamberts and friends looked into the how and why of the barrel-shaped torso of not just Cotylorhynchus, but all of its relatives as well. Their hypothesis is that instead of being a terrestrial animal, Cotylorhynchus and its relatives were semi-aquatic foragers, using their flat, paddle-like limbs for swishing around in bodies of water to look for yummy water plants to eat. Baby back ribs. The team looked at the morphology of the ribcage, the histology of the bones, and shapes of the bones to figure out what they were doing. They found that Cotylorhynchus and friends had an unusual ribcage compared to what some people might call advanced mammals. When a bone is connected to another with cartilage and tendons, it's said to be in articulation, or that one bone articulates with another. So, in the case of our Cotylorhynchus, the ribs articulate at 2 points with the vertebrae they attach to. That's not the weird part, since most mammals have this condition too. What's weird is how the ribs are at a near 90-degree angle to the vertebrae throughout the rib cage. In other words, they don't change angle like they do in modern mammals. This means that Cotylorhynchus needed muscles in between and around the ribs to help move them when it breathed. How did they eat? The combination of tiny noggin, short neck, and huge shoulder girdle presents a tremendous problem. How did they eat? How could they have been terrestrial if the range of motion in their neck was so limited? They were huge, bulky animals and must have needed a lot of food, even if they had low metabolisms. If they were strictly terrestrial herbivores, their low neck and head mobility would have restricted these behemoths to an extremely narrow swath of vegetation choices. If they were semi-aquatic, on the other hand, using their huge shovel-like limbs for paddling around, their restricted head and neck mobility wouldn't matter anymore, as they could maneuver themselves in 3 dimensions to get any number of aquatic plants they wanted. Environment doesn't equal lifestyle. These animals are usually found in rock deposits which represent dry conditions. This was used as one of the strongest arguments for their terrestriality. Contrary to this idea, plenty of sediments from the same layer of rock, but from different locations within the area, show evidence of an upland habitat that would have been home to ephemeral ponds, streams, and lakes. The exact dig site where Cotylorhynchus fossils are found show evidence of a delta lowland system, which would have been a great habitat for something like Cotylorhynchus, if it was semi-aquatic. The overall environmental conditions were wet, but the bodies of the Cotylorhynchus were found in dry areas. This doesn't make any sense. Why are they always found in dry sediments? The authors of the 2016 paper suggest the answer is as simple as the dry areas being the animals' final resting places, not their normal habitat. They found an analogy with the hippos of today. Hippos strongly depend on aquatic habitats, but when the dry season sets in, they congregate around drying water sources. If some don't leave to find a better place, they die and are buried in the now bone-dry sediment. Plus, subfossil hippo remains are found in what is presently arid regions, yet they are hippos that were adapted to aquatic habitats. Arid habitats don't tend to have a lot of digestible plant material lying around. This wouldn't have been good for a giant barrel-bodied, slow-moving, tiny-headed herbivore that needed a huge stream of food to keep itself alive. Slicing up bones for breakfast. The research team conducted some bone histology studies on the limb and rib bones of adult and juvenile remains. This was to find out what kind of lifestyle the bones themselves might elucidate. Histology is the study of microscopic structures of tissues, which encompasses living tissues, organs and bones, and fossilized tissues, just bones. The process involves cutting an ultra-thin slice of whatever sample you're testing and affixing that slice to a glass slide to put in a microscope for analysis. The study of bone histology in these critters is a more objective proxy for testing the hypothesis of a semi-aquatic habit, since just analyzing the shape of the bones is open to more bias. When the bone slices were slid onto the microscope, the team found that the bones of the Cotylorhynchus specimens had a lot of holes throughout. Now, you usually find a lot more holes in a juvenile animal, which decrease in size and amount as the animal ages, but in the present case, holes were found in all ages. The team referred to the condition as osteoporotic in nature.
Osteoporosis
is a condition where the bones start losing bone and become more sponge-like. This can be from getting old, like in us humans, or it can be an evolutionary adaptation. Birds evolved this to become lighter to fly, and some semi-aquatic to aquatic animals evolved this to float. This is fairly good evidence that Cotylorhynchus was a semi-aquatic animal. What that diaphragm do? According to the authors,
soft tissue and physiological characteristics in extinct animals can mostly be inferred only indirectly.
This means that stuff that doesn't fossilize can be inferred to have existed in or on the animal when it was alive only indirectly, because it doesn't or rarely fossilizes. No one will likely ever find a fossilized dino heart, a pterosaur's lungs, or Dimetrodon's penis. Obviously, super rare events happen, and you do end up with specimens that preserve some breathtaking pieces of anatomy. Since we're talking about a vertebrate tetrapod amniote beast, it definitely had a heart, lungs, liver, pancreas. We can assume or infer that these creatures had these organs, as all living cousins and descendants have these organs too. It becomes way trickier when discussing specific organs that evolutionarily appear at specific times, or soft tissues on the outside of the animal, like wattles.
If such characteristics are fed into the reconstruction of an evolutionary scenario, they have to be considered assumptions that might have to be modified subsequently, and all of it is by nature a deductive approach, which, nonetheless, is the only available way to at least partially revive animals that checked out some 250 million years ago.
Can I just say I love the way this paper was written? They insert some casual lingo and I love it. I abhor a boring paper, and I'm sure you do too. This quote is trying to give you the message that what they're hypothesizing is just that, a hypothesis. A constantly changing model of how to reconstruct the biology of a Cotylorhynchus. A lot of reptiles and stem mammals breathe with the help of their ribs. Technically we do too, but our lungs are doing most of the work with help from muscles. The Cotylorhynchus ribs, as I mentioned earlier, are not very flexible and would have only provided good enough respiration for the beast if it was a sedentary terrestrial critter. If you're an aquatic or semi-aquatic critter, you need some more complicated machinery to help you breathe. The authors write,
Casiids appear functionally incapable of purely terrestrial living, but their respiratory system was unsuitable for an aquatic life. The impossible meets the improbable.
Casiids are the group to which Cotylorhynchus belongs, by the way. The answer to this conundrum is a second breathing mechanism to help them get enough air to be semi-aquatic. The authors ran through a list of possible organs that modern animals use. Some pump large amounts of air into their lungs with the help of their throats. They literally gulp down throatfuls of air. This was deemed unlikely for Cotylorhynchus due to the small head and huge torso. Modern crocs primarily use their ribs to help get the air they need, but also have a piston-like mechanism wherein they push their liver backwards where parts of their pelvis is, and that part of the pelvis just moves out of the way. This was deemed unlikely for Cotylorhynchus because their pelvises weren't mobile enough. Birds and their dinosaurian ancestors use a mechanism called sternal or gastralial pumping, where they pump air into their lungs by squishing their chest and belly ribs into their bodies. Cotylorhynchus couldn't do this due to how immobile their ribs were in the up and down direction. Their best bet was on a proto-diaphragm. In us, the diaphragm is a parachute-shaped slab of muscle that rests in between and underneath the cup side of our lungs. When we breathe in, the thing bends downwards to help our lungs suck in air. When we breathe out, it bends back upwards to shunt air out of our lungs. This muscle is found only in mammals. Now, Cotylorhynchus is a member of the group Casisauria, which is a part of the clade Synapsida. We too are synapsids, meaning we share an evolutionary kinship with the beer keg on legs. At some point, the diaphragm had to have evolved from different steps and transitions of muscular flaps. The authors suggest this is the simplest and best answer to how these creatures got enough air into them to have a lifestyle that their bones suggest. The team of researchers make sure to cover their ass by stating they aren't suggesting Cotylorhynchus and kin had an advanced diaphragm seen in modern mammals, but a proto-diaphragm that would have been better than no diaphragm. All in the family. Cotylorhynchus belonged to the family Casiidae, which was a part of the much larger group Casisauria. All of these critters were similar to Cotylorhynchus in having huge barrel-shaped bodies, large broad limbs, long tails, and small heads. Cotylorhynchus is the one that takes all of these to the extreme, of course. The most recent analysis places Ankylosaurus as the closest known relative of the big cup-nosed monster. The Russian Inatosaurus, known from many juvenile remains and a single adult skull, was around during the Middle Permian and was a bit more distantly related to Cotylorhynchus. The rest of its family tree is filled with Cassia, Oromictor, and a slew of delicious, plump herbivores that'd take me 5 extra minutes to list off. Chaos effect. Behemoths pay no mind to the rain. A belly must be filled, and downpours, no matter how cold, no matter how hard, are easier to ignore than empty stomachs. Besides, the rain softens the soil, making it easier to unearth tubers and roots. Those are the tasty parts of plants, more tender and less fibrous, more flavorful and less bitter. Thunder rumbles and the wind kicks rain into the synapsid's eyes, but it doesn't notice. Its mind is focused on a thick knot of roots, freshly revealed and glistening in the mud. Cotylorhynchus remains are found from the early Permian to the late Permian in some places. This means this single genus saw the zenith of stem mammal evolution and the mass extinction of 90 to 95% of all life on the planet. It too went down with that 95%. During the early parts of its reign, Cotylorhynchus lived in a lusher environment. Horsetails, ferns, seed ferns, and lycophytes were the major rulers of the plant world. Cotylorhynchus would have spent many an early morning snorkeling for water mosses and other water plants that have yet to be found. The deposits where Cotylorhynchus were found didn't turn up a great variety of other animals, but since we know when and where Cotylorhynchus lived, you can be relatively certain of the types of critters it lived with. Early Permian southwestern North America was terrorized by the mighty Dimetrodon. This fin-backed predator was also a proto-mammal and carried a set of differently shaped teeth to help it render different parts of its prey. Cotylorhynchus would have grown too large for Dimetrodon to pose a threat, but when they were young they had to keep a lookout if they took a siesta away from the safety of the water. A better prey item for Dimetrodon and a contemporary plant stripper was Edaphosaurus. This proto-mammal was a sailback too, but its sail had weird spiny branches along each spine. When in the water, Cotylorhynchus may have been accompanied by lungfishes, weird predatory coelacanth-like fishes called osteolepiforms, cartilaginous fishes like the many-spined eel-like Xenacanthus, or the plate-toothed Platotus. Before the amphibians we know today existed, there were the temnospondyl amphibians like Chenoprosopus, Edops, the killer bullfrog salamander Eriops, the sail-backed Platyhystrix, or the crowned Zatrachis. Little lizard-like animals called reptilians, like Romeria or Rheodenticulatus, scampered through the underbrush or scaled the trees. There were more synapsids here too, like Cutlaria, a small predator like Dimetrodon without a sail, or Ophiocodon, a scissor-jawed critter that scuttled after any number of prey items. As the Permian went on, global warming, oceanic anoxia, and ocean acidification occurred as a result of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases emitting from the volcanic eruptions at the Siberian traps. This caused total global chaos and the mass extinction of about 90% of all life on the planet. This took about 100,000 years and occurred at the very end of the Permian period. However, the world was seeing signs of the catastrophe millions of years before, like with the warming of the planet and desertification of the interior of Pangaea. The surviving Cotylorhynchus of the mid and late Permian would have moved to where bodies of water still remained, and largely adapted to living with similar organisms. However, the sailbacks went extinct, replaced by Gorgonopsians. The Gorgonopsians were saber-toothed, short-tailed, straight-legged predators, much more mammal-like in appearance. Most of the proto-mammal herbivores of the early Permian were replaced by the heavily armored reptilian pariasaurs and beak-tusked proto-mammal dicynodonts. These animals were some of the weirdest around. They weren't even so detached from us that they'd be truly alien. They were our relatives. What more lies in wait in the rocks of southwestern North America's Permian period? What do you think of Cotylorhynchus? Let me know in the comments section below. Make sure you leave a like and comment on this video, share it around, and subscribe. While you're at it, ring the notification bell too if you want to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching. Want to help Edge out? Subscribe to the Patreon at any tier you like for a whole smorgasbord of delicious offerings. Many thanks to Thea Svensson, Steve Bradshaw, Staniforth Hopkins, Nattycat, Dinosaur, Arda Bayer, Abby Smith, Henry Brennan, Dana Manchester, Chris Frampton, and Antron. You've all helped to make this channel possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you.